I find this is something that a lot of new gardeners don't they don't even know that it's a thing that they should consider. Hi, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to Auxhart Gardening. I am sitting down with you today in my garden to share some tips for all of the new gardeners out there. So I've been gardening for about 3 years, and that's actually not a lot in the grand scheme of things, so I am by no means an expert, but I do feel like I have some really valuable tips to share because I am so close to the beginning, and yet I have these 3 years of experience under my belt. I think the learning curve is kind of high, and so in those first few years, you're learning a lot of stuff. And I have learned a lot that I want to share with you guys. And whereas I've only been gardening for 3 years, and I feel like I remember very clearly what it was like when I was first starting out, there are people who have been gardening like say 20, 30 years, and these things that are struggles for new gardeners are habit to them. They are just assumed. And so they might forget that there are people starting out who struggle with these kinds of things. And so I just wanted to offer to all of you new gardeners out there my perspective as somebody who's been gardening for a few years, learning a lot along the way, and still very vividly remembers how hard it was when I first started out. So my first tip for you is to make soil your priority. There are a lot of other things to get excited about gardening. They're flashy things, like what variety are you going to plant? Is it going to be pretty? Is it going to be tasty? And it's very exciting to think about those sorts of things. But I think it's really important for you to focus first on making sure you're building soil for your garden that is going to support all of these beautiful plants that you want to grow. Make soil your number one priority. You want something that is full of organic matter and life. So ideally, you want a really good, well-rounded compost to plant in. And if you're working on a tight budget and buying compost or soil is one of those things that you are planning for in your gardening budget, then I recommend that you do spend the money on getting the better soil, compost, whatever you're planning on buying, as opposed to spending that money buying fancy varieties of plants. Because if your soil isn't good, these fancy varieties of plants, it doesn't matter what they are, they're not going to do as well if your foundation of your soil is not solid and full of life and nutrients. My second tip to you is to grow things that you know you're going to eat. Now, I got stuck in this trap when I first started gardening. There's all these vegetables that are like typical garden vegetables that people talk about growing and that you can buy, from the store and all the seed packets, or that they are already started and sold in the store for you. And a lot of people are like, oh, this sounds like the sort of thing I should plant in the garden. Let's get some of this and some of that. And then they get to the point where they're harvesting this thing and they're like, oh wow, how do I cook this? And I make a whole series of videos for this phenomenon. If you find yourself caught in that, it's called Harvest and Cook. And I talk a lot about when to harvest that thing, and then I share recipes for that thing, especially for things that people don't normally think about what they're going to do with when they plant it. One of the ones that people seem to find the most helpful is sage. It's like one of those herbs that you plant in your garden. It's just like, that's one of the herbs that people plant in an herb garden. And then people have this large, lovely sage plant, and they're like, what am I going to do with this? So I think it's really important to think about what you buy from the grocery store already. What are you eating a lot of? What do you love to eat? And plant that. And then when you're farther along in your gardening journey, venture out into new foods, new varieties, stuff to plant. But if you're new at gardening, I recommend just starting with what you know and what you know you can use. So my third tip for you is to be prepared to share with the bugs. It is going to be impossible for you to grow a garden without your vegetables incurring some form of bug damage. And whether or not you choose to garden with pesticides and sprays, which I do not, but even if you do, you're still going to end up having some of that damage, and there's not a lot you can do about it. And so the one thing that you can do is kind of prepare yourself for that inevitability and either plant extra because some of it's going to get eaten by bugs, or just, be okay with eating bug damage things. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can incur pest damage that doesn't entirely ruin the edibility of your harvest. For example, slugs getting to your lettuce leaves. When they're done with the lettuce leaf, that's just got holes in it. The rest of it is fully edible to you. It's just got holes in it. It's just not pretty anymore. If the end of your eggplant gets munched on by something, you can still cut that end off, and usually the rest of the eggplant is just fine. And so these are the things you have to just be mentally prepared for. Your garden, no matter how hard you try, is never going to be full of entirely perfect, untouched by bugs produce. All right, tip number 4 is to take the time to learn about each plant that you want to have in your garden and the specific needs of that plant. If you're somebody who is into books, you might want to read through some books about it, but I think most of us know how to use Google and would prefer to look things up. And so Google kind of becomes your new best friend when you are starting a garden, because you start looking up stuff like, when should I plant this thing? How long does it need to grow? What sort of temperatures are good for it? What sort of temperatures kill it? And et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of people jump into, it's springtime, plant all the things in the garden, and they don't take the time to learn about the specific needs of each of their plants. And so you'll find that when you are planting everything at the same time and treating it all the same way, your results are not going to be as good as if you are planting things during the temperatures that they want to be planted and giving them the amount of water that they want and giving them the amount of sunlight and or shade that they want. So if you go into your gardening prepared to look up at the needs of all of your plants, you're gonna have a lot better results than if you just plant everything at once in the spring and then treat it all the same. And kind of in the same vein as that, tip number 5 is to learn about the weather in your area. So this includes learning about your zone, which, to be honest, doesn't affect too much of vegetable gardening, because all a zone is it's telling you your average low temperature for the year. So this tells you whether or not you get a temperature that's low enough to kill a plant. And that's where you get, something is perennial in this zone, but not in this zone. That's because in this zone, it stays warm enough not to kill it. And in this zone over here, it gets cold enough to kill it. And therefore, in this zone, it is an annual, whereas where it's warmer, it's a perennial. So learning about the weather in your area, besides learning about your zone, it's really more about learning when are your frost dates, how hot does it get in the summer, how cool does it get in the winter. Sure, if you want to grow stuff over the winter, sometimes that's an option and something you need to think about. But you want to learn how much does it rain? Are you going to need to supplement with a lot of water or maybe only a little bit of water? It's things like this that you need to kind of have in the back of your mind when you're thinking about and in the process of starting a garden and deciding what to plant and when. And I will say, even just listening to myself say all of that out loud, it sounds like a lot and it sounds kind of overwhelming. And so if you feel that way when I just said that, don't worry, because a lot of this stuff with learning about your climate and your weather comes from experience. You can get a head start if you know that that's something that you're supposed to kind of learn about, but you'll kind of get a feel for it as the seasons go along. All right, and tip number 6 is to keep it simple. Gardening is a lot more work than you think it is. If you've never gardened before and you have a concept in your head of how much work you think gardening is, it's probably going to be a little bit more than that. So I know that you're excited to plant all the things and have this big, beautiful garden, but this first year, just keep it simple, because you'll have a much higher chance of success if you're not overwhelmed by everything that you've set yourself up for. All right, tip number 7 is a little more concrete, and that is to plan to mulch your garden. I find this is something that a lot of new gardeners don't like, they don't even know that it's a thing that they should consider. You'll notice that my garden is covered in wood chips and straw, and this is a mulch. This is something that goes on top of the soil and acts as a barrier between the soil and the air and the sun, and a barrier between it's a barrier that's keeping out the sun and the air and keeping in the water, I guess. So this is going to improve the health of your soil and also decrease the amount of watering that you have to do, and it's just going to improve the health of your garden overall, because when you have exposed soil, especially exposed to the sun, it's missing that barrier to allow water to escape, so it's going to dry out. And the sun additionally is going to UV radiate and kill any life that's right there in that first little bit of soil. And by putting a layer of mulch on top, you are protecting that life that is in the soil that is contributing to the health of your plants. And you're also going to keep the water from escaping, which the water is good for your plants, but also good for the life in the soil. All right, tip number 8 is to use trellises to make the most of your space. I'm guessing that most of you are not starting out with a giant garden space that you just happen to have the room. A lot of people who are new gardeners are trying to start in containers, or they're starting in some small raised beds in their backyard. And if you are not one of those people, you happen to actually have a huge space that you're like, yeah, I'm gung-ho, I'm gonna go garden in this whole huge space, and I have way more space than I need, so I don't need to think about how to maximize my space at all. This is not for you, and also I'm very jealous of you. But most of us have to think about maximizing our space using trellises. And while there's some things that you might want to trellis for other practical reasons, such as keeping the fruit off the ground, a lot of times you can trellis something in order to save space. And so things like this are small vining squashes. You can actually trellis those off the ground, and instead of taking up this whole area where they're vining over the ground, you can vertically trellis them up, and then they're only taking up that little bit of ground where the roots are. And there's a lot of different things like this. So think about trellises not only as a way to support your plants, make your garden beautiful, but it's also a way to maximize space. Tip number 9 is to spend as much time in your garden as you can. Mostly, I mean, spend some time in your garden where you're not working, you're just looking and enjoying. And this is good for 2 reasons. One, you did work really hard on this, and you should enjoy it, because if you don't take the time to enjoy the beauty of the garden, you can get really bogged down in how much work it is, and then you might lose motivation to continue gardening in the future because you're forgetting to remember all the beautiful things and actually look at the flowers that you've planted, rather than seeing all of the spots on the leaves or something like that. So being in the garden can be good for that reason. The second reason that it's good for your garden is because it helps you to see things that maybe you wouldn't otherwise see. If you're only coming into your garden to do work and not taking the time to properly look at your plants, often you might miss some things. You might miss the onset of a disease or infestation that you could head off, whereas if you wait until it's so bad that it's very obvious, then perhaps there's no time to do anything about it. And this is good for things like pruning, harvesting stuff right on time. Being in the garden often helps you care better for your garden. All right, and this last tip is probably the most important one, and that is, if things die and it doesn't work out, don't let yourself believe that you have a black thumb. Nobody has a black thumb. Everybody can have a green thumb, I promise you. We don't need to be out here judging ourselves in that way. because everybody makes mistakes. It's your first year gardening. You are going to make some mistakes, and some plants are going to die, and some of that will be your fault and some of that will not be your fault, because sometimes plants just die. That they just do sometimes and that's okay. And what's more important is to remember that there's always next year. You can try again, and again, you cannot just have a black thumb. You can only have a lack of motivation and a lack of interest in the thing. I find people who kill plants over and over are people who they kind of think they want plants, but they aren't really interested in them, so they don't take the time, like I was saying, to go look at them and care for them, and then that's why they die. But again, learning to garden is such a process. I am still making mistakes now, 3 years in. You will still be making mistakes 10 years in, 15 years in. There's never going to be a perfect year of gardening, I'm sorry to tell you. So just keep going, keep trying, keep refining, and don't forget to enjoy what you've created. So with all of that being said, if you are new here, if this is the first video of mine that you're seeing, welcome. Most of what I do here on this channel is I show what I'm doing in my garden, how it's working, and when it's not working. And the goal is to give you an example of a real garden with real successes and real failures and all of the in between. I want to show you what it takes to have a garden like this, and also share with you all of the new things that I'm trying. You know, like I said, I've only been gardening for 3 years. I'm not an expert, but I love trying new things and seeing what happens. So I share a lot of that on my channel. If you mostly just want to see beautiful garden, I do a garden tour every single Wednesday, and that is part of appreciating the garden, looking at the garden to see what's going on, and then also showing you guys realistically, again, what you can expect to see from week to week in terms of changes in your plants throughout the entire season, not just the beautiful everything's growing really fast and looks really pretty season. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will put up here some more videos for new gardeners. I have an entire playlist of stuff that I think that you should know. Until next time, happy gardening.